Hi, my name is Jake Simonelli, and this is my presentation on athlete burnout from the perspective of a clinical psychologist. What is clinical psychology? Clinical psychology is one of many broad subset professions within the industry. It is generally known for its stringent clinical, scientific, and ethical standards, and is considered the most sizable and expansive domain within the field, with more than half of all psychology doctorate students opting for clinical specializations. The base assessment components applicable to clinical psychology include a primary investigation into the nature of client presentations, i.e. depressive and/or anxious symptomology, and a secondary evaluation into the severity of these presentations, which is usually measured in a graded fashion extending between mild, moderate, and severe. Clinical psychology is renowned for its cumulative approach to case formulation, and that it considers information from a number of source categories, including demographics, cognitive variables or abilities, and developmental history. Clinical psychology's relationship to sports psychology. As research continues into the similarities and differences between different schools of thought, there is evidence of an emerging overlap between these perspectives that may prove complementary and effective for instances of intervention requiring multiple theoretical angles. Perry and Ross pointed to the increasing convergence between clinical and sports psychology, citing the adoption of performance-enhancing interventions that include empirically substantiated treatment criteria. Furthermore, Leffingwell et al. Noted the number of clinical and counseling psychologists seeking additional specializations in alternative disciplines, such as sports psychology. The principles of clinical psychology are valuable to the objectives of sports psychology, including maximizing performance and implementing empirical assessments as standard. Clinical psychology's relationship to athletes. With respect to the historical relationship between clinical psychology and the athletes traditionally acclimatized to sporting psychology, 1993 saw the development of the Sports Psychology Services Initiative, which sought to link the clinical psychology faculty with the intercollegiate athletics department at the University of Washington. Operating from this combined and holistic perspective, sports psychology initiatives within the university were better able and equipped to balance athlete mental well-being and athletic performance. Perry and Ross also recalled the early 1990s as the genesis of clinical psychology's proliferation into the sports psychology domain, citing the integration of the sports psych discipline into the frontiers of clinical and counseling psychology as evidence. These trends of interdiscipline integration have continued into more recent times with the consolidation of formal sports psychology curriculum into the clinical and counseling educational frameworks. Burnout, definition and etiology. One presentation among athletes that has benefited from this collusion of sports and clinical psychology is burnout. Often treated exclusively in the sports psychology domain, clinical psychology offers robust assessment and treatment options for athletes experiencing enduring fatigue from physical and mental exertion. Clinical psychology broadly conceptualizes burnout as physical and psychological exhaustion. Professionals often cite a reduction in satisfaction from a successful performance and a loss of enjoyment normally afforded by competing as key markers in clinical burnout among athletes. From a biological perspective, burnout can be viewed as sustained autonomic nervous system arousal due to prolonged high-intensity exercise and auxiliary psychological stresses, including the pressure to perform optimally. Tamminen, Holt, and Crocker further defined burnout by including alternative psychological contributors such as fears of making performance errors, criticism, and injury, and also managing competing life demands. This heightened and sustained activation of the autonomic nervous system is linked with numerous adverse effects on the immune systems of athletes, leaving them vulnerable to viral infections and general illness. This is due to the immunosuppressive effects of excessive cortisol that often comes about with burnout. Physical and psychological burnout can present among athletes in a variety of ways, including depression, anger, and a loss of identity. Clinical psychology interventions for burnout. With respect to the unique perspective offered by clinical psychology for treating burnout, interventions are largely based around contemporary third-wave cognitive behavioral theory, which employs the voluntary act of acceptance. More specifically, the modality of choice adopted by clinical psychologists is the mindfulness acceptance commitment approach, or MAC, which is less concerned with removing negative cognitive and emotional states and more focused on building non-judgmental awareness of emerging cognitive, emotional, and physical sensations. The MAC approach satisfies the aforementioned stringent scientific standards of clinical psychology and has proven efficacious enough to be considered evidence-based practice. Rees, Pitzinger, and Yang consolidated the effectiveness of acceptance-based interventions, citing contact with the present moment and psychological flexibility as key benefits of regular mindfulness practice. Alternatively, more active psychological interventions offered by clinical psychologists include guided recovery-oriented visualization and relaxation techniques, both of which have demonstrated the function of reducing the adverse psychological effects of burnout and also injury. Looking at these active interventions in more detail, guided imagery or visualization is the act of imagining the performance of a skill or behavior in the absence of any physical action. In the context of burnout, the imagery may be focused away from sporting or performance and instead focused on other areas of the athlete's life that are often neglected due to the high demands of high performance. Specifically, mentally mapping a road to recovery has proven to boost psychological well-being. Furthermore, relaxation techniques often include diaphragmatic or deep breathing. By monitoring and regulating the levels of arousal within the nervous system, athletes are far better able to cultivate optimal psychological states for dealing with symptoms of burnout. In summary, as the interdependence among alternative psychological schools of thought is increasingly investigated, new theoretical avenues are made available to clinicians that may help to solve complex clinical problems. One such avenue is the relationship between clinical and sports psychology, which has further enriched each discipline independently by the exchange of ideas and practices. Although athletes experiencing psychological issues relating to burnout or injury can find attuned support within sports psychology, the principles and techniques offered by clinical psychology have proven effective at reducing their impact and boosting psychological wellness. There is a comprehensive assessment and treatment system afforded to athletes by clinical psychologists, including both active and passive interventions that are able to adapt to the specific needs of individual athletes. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and this is my reference list.